Japanese mythology, gods, creation, heroes and the living soul of Japan. Introduction, before the world had a name. Silence, darkness, before the world had a name, before the islands of Japan rose from the churning sea, before a single god looked upon the earth and called it good, there was nothing. Not even nothing, really, because nothing implies an absence, a void with edges. What preceded Japan's creation myth was something the ancient storytellers called chaos. Not disorder, not violence, but pure, undifferentiated potential. Heaven and earth, not yet separated. Light and dark, wound together like a thread with no beginning and no end. This state of pre-existence is where Japan's mythology begins. And it begins not with a bang, not with a word, not with a god speaking light into being, but with something quieter and stranger, and more interesting. It begins with separation. The world comes into being, not because something is created, but because something is distinguished. The lighter rises, the heavier sinks, and in that simple physical act of sorting, in the way oil rises through water, in the way cream lifts from milk, the cosmos takes its first tentative shape. Welcome. I am so glad you're here. What we are about to explore together is one of the world's great mythological traditions, a tradition that is older than the nation of Japan as we know it, older than its written language, older than its imperial institutions, and yet so alive today that its objects are displayed at coronations, its shrines rebuilt in living ceremonies, its characters recognized by every schoolchild and revered by millions of worshippers. Japanese mythology is not a relic. It is not a historical curiosity. It is an active, breathing tradition that has shaped and continues to shape one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The country that gave us the bullet train and the tea ceremony, the video game and the haiku, the precision of Toyota and the aesthetics of Miyazaki. That country's foundational stories are the ones we are going to tell today. But before we begin telling stories, I want to spend a few minutes, just a few, on context. Because these myths exist in a context, and understanding that context will make the stories richer. The texts where these stories come from. Our primary sources are two ancient chronicles. The first is the Kojiki, the record of ancient matters, compiled in 712 CE under the direction of the Emperor Genmei. The Kojiki is the oldest surviving book written in Japan. It begins with the creation of the cosmos and ends with the reign of Empress Suiko in the early 7th century. It is part myth, part genealogy, part political legitimization, part poetry collection, a document that wears many faces simultaneously. The second source is the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicles of Japan, completed just 8 years later, in 720 CE. The Nihon Shoki covers similar mythological ground, but is written in a different style. More formal, more Chinese in its literary influences, more inclined to present multiple versions of the same story side by side and let the reader decide. Where the Kojiki feels intimate, almost oral, like someone telling you a story by firelight, the Nihon Shoki feels like a court document, comprehensive, careful, self-conscious. There are also the Fudoki, regional gazetteers, compiled from the early 8th century, which contain local variations of myths and legends that sometimes differ significantly from the imperial court versions. The Fudoki remind us that mythology is never monolithic. It changes as it travels. Different communities, different regions, different political moments produce different versions of the same stories. Scholar's note. The Kojiki was compiled by Ono Yasumaro at imperial command. It was written in a complex mixed script. Chinese characters used partly for their meaning, partly for their sound, that makes it one of the most challenging texts in the Japanese literary canon to translate. The first modern English translation by Donald Philippi appeared in 1968 and remains a scholarly standard. What does this mean for us? It means we're not dealing with a single authoritative text, the way we might with the Bible or Homer. We're dealing with a rich, layered, sometimes contradictory tradition. When stories differ between the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, and they sometimes do, significantly, I'll note it. When local traditions add color and detail that the imperial chronicles omit, I'll bring that in too. The goal is not to give you one clean version of Japanese mythology. The goal is to give you the living, breathing, complicated reality of it. Now, on to the second thing I want to tell you before we begin. Shinto, the religion. These myths live. In Japanese mythology does not exist in an abstract space. It exists within, and has been shaped by, and has in turn shaped, Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan. Shinto is one of the world's oldest living religious traditions. Its name means, roughly, the way of the gods, kami no machi in Japanese. And the kami, the divine beings, are the central figures of both Shinto practice and Japanese myth. Understanding even a little about what kami means will change how you hear the stories we're about to tell. In Western religious traditions, the divine and the earthly are usually kept separate. God is transcendent, above, apart, fundamentally different from the physical world. The physical world is, depending on the tradition, either a fallen place or a place of testing, or both. But in Shinto, the divine is not separate from the physical world. It is present in it. Kami inhabit mountains, rivers, trees, rocks, animals, and people. The wind has a kami. The rice has a kami. A particularly ancient and gnarled tree might be recognized as having kami presence and wrapped in a sacred rope to mark it. The divine is not elsewhere. It is here, in the texture of the world itself. This means that the myths of Japan are not, at their core, about the human relationship with a transcendent creator. They are about the human relationship with a world that is itself alive, itself divine, itself continuously generating new forms of meaning and presence. The gods in Japanese mythology are not remote, perfect, philosophical absolutes. They weep, they rage, they make mistakes, they feel jealous and grief-stricken and triumphant and afraid. They are very, very human, because they are, in a deep sense, not separate from humanity at all. World mythology. This stands in fascinating contrast to both the Abrahamic traditions, where God is explicitly other, infinite, perfect, and even to ancient Greek mythology, where the gods are human-like, but explicitly set apart from mortals by their immortality and their residence on Olympus. The Japanese kami exist in a more permeable relationship with the human world, one in which the divine is not above, but within. The other Shinto concept we need before we start is misogi, ritual purification. Purity and impurity are central categories in Shinto thought, not in a moral sense, but in an energetic sense. Death, blood, illness, certain acts, these create kegare, a kind of spiritual contamination that disrupts the natural flow of divine energy. Misogi, purification through water, through ritual, through ceremony, restores that flow. You will see Mythology in the creation myth, in the story of Amaterasu throughout. It is the engine of spiritual renewal in the Shinto world. All right, context provided. Now, let's begin. At the very, very beginning. Chapter 1. The Creation. Myth, Izanagi and Izanami. Part 1. The Shapeless Beginning. The Cosmic Egg. In the beginning of heaven and earth, the Kojiki tells us, all was formless. The text uses an image that appears in creation myths from ancient India to ancient China. The universe as an egg. A primordial, undifferentiated mixture of all potential states of matter and energy, floating in darkness, not yet hatched into existence. What is interesting about this image is what it implies. If the universe is an egg, then it already contains everything that will ever exist, just not yet differentiated, not yet sorted, not yet separated into the distinct things that constitute the world as we experience it. Creation, in this telling, is not the making of something from nothing. Creation is the act of sorting, of distinguishing, of separating what is already latent within the whole. This is a profoundly different model of creation than the one most Westerners have inherited. In Genesis, God creates ex nihilo, from nothing. He speaks, and things come into being that were not there before. In Japanese cosmogony, nothing is created from nothing. The cosmic material already exists. What changes is its arrangement. World mythology. The physicist might recognize something familiar in this. The Big Bang Theory does not posit creation from nothing exactly. It posits the expansion and differentiation of an initial state of extreme density. The Japanese creation myth is, in this respect, oddly resonant with modern cosmology. Not because the ancient storytellers had scientific knowledge, but because the pattern they intuited, chaos differentiating into cosmos, is a genuinely universal template for understanding origins. Gradually, the texts say, the lighter, purer elements rose and became the heavens. The heavier, denser elements sank and settled into what would eventually become the earth. This separation was the first act of the universe, not explosive or violent, but slow and gravitational, like sediment settling in still water. The Kotoa Matsukami, the first gods. From this act of cosmic separation, the first gods spontaneously appeared. The Kojiki names them carefully, 5 solitary deities, each distinct, each appearing in the newly differentiated heavens and then, mysteriously, concealing their forms. They vanish from the narrative almost as soon as they appear. These are the Kotoa Matsukami, the separate heavenly deities. Their names carry cosmological meaning. Amenomi Nakanushi, Lord of the august center of heaven. Takami Musubi, High Creator. Kami Musubi, Divine Creator. They sound less like individuals and more like principles, like the universe naming its own operating procedures, creation, center, polarity. These forces exist, do their work, and step back. After the 5 solitary deities, 7 generations of paired deities emerge, male and female in combination, or, in some cases, ambiguous, each pair given names that often seem to describe aspects of the earth coming into form. Earth settling, mud curdling, roots sprouting. The world is slowly taking shape, one divine generation at a time. And with each generation, the gods become slightly more concrete, slightly more anthropomorphic, slightly more like the passionate, complicated beings we're about to meet. Scholar's note: The concept of concealing their form, kakurimiara, yin rishen, is significant in Shinto thought. Many kami are understood to be present but invisible, detectable only through their effects, the way we feel wind without seeing it. The early creation deities might be understood as cosmic principles, whose concealment is their normal mode of existence. They are not absent. They are simply operating at a level below visibility. The last of these 7 generations produces 2 figures who will not conceal themselves, 2 gods who are given specific bodies, specific names, specific instructions, and a specific mission. The male, Izanagi no Mikoto. The female, Izanami no Mikoto. And with them, the real story begins. Part 2. Izanagi and Izanami. The jeweled spear and the first island. The heavenly gods looked down from above at the newly formed lower world. They could see it, drifting there below, like young water plants floating on the surface of a pond. Something almost like land, but not yet solid. A world in potentia waiting to be shaped. They called Izanagi and Izanami before them, and gave them their mission. The land below is not yet formed, the heavenly gods said. It drifts and wanders. Go down and make it solid. Complete it. Bring it into being. And with this charge they presented them with a magnificent object, the Ame no Nuboko, the heavenly jeweled spear. Not a weapon, despite the name, but an instrument of creation, long, jeweled, gleaming, a tool for reaching down into the waters of chaos and stirring something into existence. The 2 gods stood on the Ama no Ukihashi, the floating bridge of heaven. Let that image settle for a moment. A bridge floating in the sky between heaven and the primordial sea below. No ground at either end, just the bridge itself, suspended in the gap between the ordered divine realm and the still-forming lower world. This is a liminal space, a threshold space, neither one thing nor another. The perfect place to begin a creation. They thrust the spear downward into the ocean below and stirred. The sound of the sea churning around that cosmic spear, ko-wo-ro, is actually rendered onomatopoeically in the Kojiki. The ancient storyteller wanted you to hear it. The thick, wet, swirling sound of chaos being worked into something. When they lifted the spear, the brine dripped from its tip, and drop by drop, those drops of brine solidified as they fell, crystallizing, accreting, layer upon layer, until they formed an island. Onogoro, the first piece of solid ground in the history of the universe, built from the dripping of a spear. It rose from the sea like a mountain finding its footing. Scholars note, the name Onogoro, Zi Ningdao, means roughly self-curdling island, or the island that curdled itself. The image of brine crystallizing and solidifying is surprisingly accurate to the geological process by which oceanic islands actually do form. Volcanic matter solidifying as it is expelled from the ocean floor into cooler water. The ancient storytellers, of course, had no geology, but the poetic image they chose is not far from scientific reality. Izanagi and Izanami descended to this island. They built a pillar, the Ame no Mehashira, the august pillar of heaven, and around it, a magnificent hall. And here, in this palace at the center of the first island in the world, they became husband and wife, the birth of the islands. The union of Izanagi and Izanami was not simply a marriage. It was the operating mechanism of creation. Together, They became the generative force that produced the physical world, and the method was, in the Kojiki's telling, almost biological. They circled the pillar, Izanagi going one way, Izanami the other, met at the middle, spoke words of attraction and desire, and from their union the world was born. Their first child, born before the islands, was a failed creation, a boneless, weak child called Hiruko, the leech child. They set it adrift in a basket of reeds and let the sea take it. The heavenly gods consulted about why this first birth had gone wrong, determined that there had been a ritual error in the ceremony of meeting. Izanami had spoken first, rather than Izanagi. Female before male, when it should have been male before female. They corrected the error, performed the ceremony again, and this time the creation succeeded. World mythology. This element, the ritual error and correction, is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. It suggests a society already concerned with the proper ordering of ceremony, already aware that how you do something matters as much as what you do. It also, frankly, reflects the patriarchal values of the court society that commissioned these texts. But many scholars note that in some regional traditions, the female-speaking first version was not an error at all, that Izanami's priority was simply natural in older tellings. With the ritual corrected, the great births began. Awaji Island came first, then Shikoku, the smallest of Japan's 4 main islands, then Oki, the remote islands in the Sea of Japan, then Kyushu, the southwestern island, named in the myth for its 9 provinces, then Iki and Tsushima, the small islands between Japan and Korea, then Sado, and finally Yamato, Great Honshu, the central island, the largest of all, the Japanese archipelago, island by island, born from the bodies of gods. Then, having given birth to the land itself, they gave birth to the gods of nature, God of the sea, God of rivers, God of wind, Fujin, who would be depicted for millennia as a muscular figure carrying a bag of winds, a bag he is perpetually trying to keep closed. Gods of mountains, of trees, of grass, of earth, of stone, of autumn, of rain. Dozens of deities, each one an aspect of the natural world given divine personhood, given name and story, given the capacity to be invoked and honored and appeased. The world was taking shape. It was growing populated, textured, alive. And then came the birth that would end everything. The death of Izanami. Fire enters the world. The fire god's name was Kagutsuchi, or in other texts, Homusubi, he who sets fire. His very birth was an act of consuming his own mother. The flames of his divine body burned Izanami as she bore him. The burns were not simply painful, they were fatal. The goddess who had given birth to the islands of Japan, to the sea and mountains and rivers and wind, lay dying, burned from within by the child she had just brought into the world. Even in her dying, creation continued. From her vomit, as she retched in pain, new gods emerged, gods of metal, gods of clay. From her waste came more gods. From her urine came yet more. Even decomposing, even in agony, Izanami's body was still a source of new being. The Kojiki does not flinch from this. It records it carefully, clinically almost, this catalogue of gods born from suffering, as if the ancient storyteller wanted us to understand something about creation, that it is not clean, that it costs something, that the birth of the world was simultaneously the birth of death. And then she was gone. Izanami, the she who invites, the co-creator of the Japanese archipelago, the mother of the natural world, died, lay still, descended to Yomi. Izanagi sat beside her body and wept. His tears themselves became a god, Nakisawame, the crying swamp female, one of the minor deities of sorrow. And then his grief turned to rage. He looked at Kagutsuchi, this fire god, this child who had killed his mother in the act of being born, and he could not bear what he saw. He drew the Totsuka no Tsurugi, his 10-span sword, and he cut his own son into pieces. From the pieces of the slaughtered fire god, more gods were born. 8 gods from the blood that spattered from the blade. Gods from the head, the chest, the belly, the genitals, the left hand, the right hand, the left foot, the right foot. Even in dismemberment, even in furious, grief-driven murder, new gods, new aspects of the world. The Kojiki is telling us something about the nature of divinity. It cannot be destroyed. It transforms, it scatters, it becomes something else. But it persists, scholars note. Some scholars read the birth and death of Kagutsuchi as a mythological explanation for the volcanic activity that shaped the Japanese islands. Japan sits on the Ring of Fire and has been formed by volcanic forces over millions of years. The fire god born from the creative union of heaven and earth, who kills his own mother in being born. This image maps, metaphorically, onto the geological fire that both created and repeatedly devastated the land. But Kagutsuchi was dead, and Izanami was still in Yomi, and Izanagi made a decision that would define the rest of his story. He would go and get her back. The descent into Yomi, the first grief journey, Yomi no Kuni, the land of Yomi, the underworld of Japanese mythology. It is important to understand what Yomi is and what it is not. It is not a place of punishment. There is no judgment at the gates of Yomi, no weighing of souls, no assignment to paradise or torment based on the quality of a life lived. Yomi is simply where the dead go. It is dark, underground, and, as we are about to discover, fundamentally contaminating to the living. It is a place of kegare, of impurity, the source of the most fundamental pollution in the Shinto universe, the pollution of death. The fact that Izanagi went there anyway tells us everything about the depth of his grief. He descended into the darkness. We are not told how, through what passage, down what path, across what boundary. The Kojiki moves over this transition quickly, almost as if the passage between the world of the living and the world of the dead is less remarkable than what waits on the other side. He descended, and he found himself in darkness, and he called for Izanami. Her voice came back from the dark, distant, hollow, wrong in some way, that the text doesn't fully specify but that you can feel in the telling. Her voice was there, but something was different. Something had changed in her. "My love," Izanagi said, "come back with me. The land is not yet complete. We have more to create, more to do. I need you. The world needs you." A pause. Then Izanami's voice, careful and measured. "I have already eaten the food of this land. I have become of Yomi. I may not be able to return, but do not come in. Do not follow me. Do not light your torch. Wait at the entrance. I will go to the gods of Yomi and ask if I may leave." He waited. The darkness was total. No stars, no moon, no flicker of any light, no sound except the distant movement of things he could not see and did not want to identify. He didn't know how much time was passing. In Yomi, there may be no time, or time may move differently, or cease to matter. He stood at the entrance to the underworld and waited for his wife to come back, and waited, and kept waiting. The Kojiki does not tell us how long he waited. Long enough that when he finally broke, when the silence and the darkness became more than he could endure, we do not judge him. We understand. Any of us would have done the same. He reached into his hair and took out the hair comb that held his hair in its knot. He broke off one of the teeth. He held it up and lit it, a small, trembling flame in the vastness of Yomi. The forbidden look, horror in the underworld, what he saw. The ancient texts do not soften this. They describe it with the clinical precision of a nightmare that has been recorded exactly because the recorder could not look away. Izanami's body was rotting. Her flesh was swollen and blackened with decomposition. Maggots moved through her, white and purposeful, going about the work of transformation that death always assigns to them. Her body was no longer a body in the sense Izanagi had known. It was becoming something else, returning to the earth that she had helped to create, and in each part of her, a thunder god. 8 thunder deities, each one having taken up residence in a different region of her decomposing body. Oikadzuchi in her head, Honoikadzuchi in her chest, Kuroikadzuchi in her belly, Sakuikadzuchi in her genitals, Wakaikadzuchi in her left hand, Tsuchikadzuchi in her right hand, Narikadzuchi in her left foot, Funikadzuchi in her right foot. 8 manifestations of divine thunderous power, each one inhabiting the body of the woman who had given birth to the world. Izanagi screamed. The Kojiki uses a specific word for the sound he made, a word that implies something beyond ordinary fear, beyond simple shock, something that goes down to the bone and changes you. He turned and ran, and Izanami woke, or, and this is perhaps more accurate, she became aware of what had just happened. She felt the light. She felt the shame. She had told him not to look. She had known what she looked like, had known what the food of Yomi had made of her body, and she had wanted to spare him, or herself, or both of them, from the reality of her transformation. And now he had looked anyway, had seen her at her most vulnerable, her most hideous, her most irrevocably other. "You have shamed me," she said into the darkness behind him. Her voice was no longer careful, no longer measured. "You looked when I told you not to look. I will not forgive this." She sent the Shikome after him, the ugly women of Yomi, the female demons of the underworld, pursuers who knew this darkness better than any living thing. She sent the 8 thunder gods from her own body. She sent 1,500 demons of Yomi into the chase. Izanagi ran with everything he had. The chase through Yomi is one of the great action sequences in world mythology, and like all great action sequences, its tension comes not from the violence, but from the creativity it demands. Izanagi could not simply outrun the demons of the underworld on their home ground. He had to think. He pulled the black vine tying his hair and threw it behind him. It became a vine of black grapes, a fat cluster hanging in the dark. The Shikome stopped to eat. He pulled the comb from his hair, the very comb he had broken to make his torch, and threw it behind him. The teeth of the comb became bamboo shoots erupting from the ground. The demons stopped to eat those too. He was buying seconds. Each improvised obstacle, buying him a few more feet of ground, a few more seconds of distance from something that wanted to drag him down into the darkness permanently. He reached the even pass of Yomi. the slope leading back up toward the world of the living, and found, growing at its base, 3 peaches on a tree. He seized them and hurled them at his pursuers. The peaches struck and the demons fled, all 1,500 of them, back into the depths they had come from. Modern Japan. The apotropaic power of peaches, their ability to repel evil, became a fixture of Japanese folk tradition. Momotaro, one of the most beloved characters in Japanese folklore, is literally Peach Boy, a hero born from a peach who battles demons. The same fruit that Izanagi used against the demons of Yomi echoes across Japanese culture for thousands of years. But the greatest barrier was still to come. Izanami herself appeared at the entrance to Yomi. No longer the gentle goddess, no longer the careful voice in the darkness, but something transformed by death and fury and shame. Izanagi gathered all his remaining strength and heaved an enormous boulder, the Chigaishi no Okami, across the entrance to Yomi. The great god, a road turning back. This boulder sealed the passage between the living world and the dead one, and it stands there still, the ancient storytellers say, somewhere in the land, the boundary between what lives and what has died. They faced each other across that stone, 2 gods who had created the world together, who had stood on the floating bridge of heaven and stirred the primordial sea with a jeweled spear, who had given birth to the islands and the mountains and the seas, separated now by a rock that neither of them could move. Izanami's voice came through the stone, cold and inevitable. If you do this, if you leave me here, if you seal this entrance and go back to the world without me, I will take 1,000 lives from your land, every single day, 1,000 people dead by my hand. Izanagi's voice came back without hesitation. Then I will cause 1,500 to be born, every single day, 1,500 new lives to answer your 1,000 deaths. Silence. And that, the ancient texts tell us with quiet confidence, is the explanation for the fact of human mortality, and for the fact that despite mortality, humanity persists and grows. Death takes 1,000. Life makes 1,500. The gap between those 2 numbers, that small daily surplus of births over deaths, that is why we are still here. World Mythology. This exchange between Izanagi and Izanami at the sealed entrance to the underworld is one of the most compressed and powerful cosmological explanations in world mythology. Compare it with the book of Genesis, where death enters the world through disobedience and sin, with Sumerian mythology, where the goddess Inanna must die and be reborn for the world to remain fertile, with Norse mythology, where death and rebirth are built into the very architecture of the cosmos. In every case, the story is trying to answer the same question: why do we die? Japan's answer is, because a goddess in the underworld is taking 1,000 lives a day. And the only reason we survive her is that life itself is more prolific than death. The purification, 3 great children from water. Izanagi emerged from the underworld into the world of the living, and immediately felt what any contact with Yomi produces in the Shinto understanding: kagare, impurity, contamination. He had been in the place of the dead, had seen decomposition, and been chased by demons. He was not physically hurt, but spiritually, energetically, he was polluted in a way that had to be cleansed. He went to the river, the Ahaji no Woto, some texts say, a river in what is now Kyushu, and began the ritual of misogi. He stripped off his clothes. Each garment and accessory, as it was removed, became a new god, 12 in total, embodying aspects of illness and purification, and the boundary between the living and the dead. Even in this act of cleaning himself of Yomi's pollution, Izanagi's body was generating new divine beings. Then he washed. He dipped beneath the water. And from the act of washing himself, from specific physical acts of purification on his own body, 3 gods emerged who would become the axis of Japanese civilization. He washed his left eye, and from the water that touched his left eye, Amaterasu Omikami was born, the great divinity illuminating heaven, the sun herself. He washed his right eye, and from the water there, Tsukuyomi no Mikoto emerged, the count of the moon, the god of the night sky. He washed his nose, and from that water came Susanoo no Mikoto, the impetuous male, the god of storms. Izanagi looked at these 3 children and felt something he had not felt since before his journey to Yomi. Joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. He called them the Mehashira no Uzumiko, the 3 precious children. He took his necklace, the string of jewels that had hung around his neck since the beginning of creation, and placed it around Amaterasu's neck. "You will rule the high plane of heaven," he told her. "To Tsukuyomi, you will rule the realm of night. To Susanoo, you will rule the seas." Then, the Kojiki tells us with some pathos, Izanagi is not much heard from again. He had done his great work. He had created the land, mourned his wife, survived the underworld, and produced 3 radiant children. He retreated to a realm called Ahaji, or in some texts Awa, and remained there in a kind of divine retirement. His story was, in the deepest sense, complete, but his children's stories were just beginning.